ओके, आपको वीडियो शेयर स्क्रीन, 1 सेकेंड, आई जस्ट, आपको अभी नहीं दिखेगा शेयर स्क्रीन. नाउ आई थिंक यू कैन सी शेयर स्क्रीन देयर. नाउ यू कैन सी शेयर स्क्रीन सर. हाँ, तो बस उसको शेयर स्क्रीन को क्लिक करिए सर, तो आपको एक और विंडो कुछ खुल जाएगी. नहीं, आपका वीडियो करना पीछे बैकग्राउंड में खोल के रखिए, एक बार ओपन खोल के रखिए. हाँ सर.
अच्छा, ओके, स्टार्ट माय वीडियो.
यस सर.
ओके, अच्छा, अब आप देख रहे हैं.
आपको देख रहा हूँ सर. आप वीडियो को शेयर करिए सर.
हाँ, वीडियो को ही शेयर किया है. जो शेयर स्क्रीन है, शेयर स्क्रीन को क्लिक किया.
यस सर.
हाँ, तो उसके बाद वीडियो तो दिख नहीं रहा है इसमें. अब वीडियो तो है मेरे पास में, वीडियो खुला हुआ मैंने खोल के रखा है.
जस्ट शेयर स्क्रीन आएगा ना, तो वहाँ पे आपका बहुत सारे वो खुल जाएंगे, विंडो खुल जाएंगे.
वर्चुअल बैकग्राउंड.
नहीं, शेयर स्क्रीन आप करोगे, क्लिक करोगे,
हाँ,
बहुत सारे विंडोज खुल जाएंगे.
नहीं, शेयर स्क्रीन के नीचे, शेयर स्क्रीन को क्लिक करने के बाद मैं बताता हूँ, नीचे में वर्चुअल बैकग्राउंड है, रिकॉर्डिंग है, स्टैटिस्टिक्स है, फीडबैक है, कीबोर्ड, एक्सेसिबिलिटी. और उसके राइट साइड में है शेयर स्क्रीन किया है, उसमें इंटर फुल स्क्रीन, स्केल टू फिट साइड बाय साइड मोड.
One second. Now you do. Now try again, sir.
ट्राई तो मैं कर रहा हूँ, लेकिन
You should be able to share.
share selected app window only. Okay.
ये शेयर स्क्रीन आप क्लिक करोगे, इट विल
हाँ,
ओपन वन मोर विंडो बेसिक. उसमें जो
हाँ,
भी आपको शेयर करना है, जस्ट क्लिक दैट.
हाँ, लेकिन नहीं, लेकिन शेयर स्क्रीन करने से वो विंडो नहीं खुल रहा है. शेयर देखो, जो हमारा खुला है ना, उसमें सेटिंग्स में वीडियो, ऑडियो, शेयर स्क्रीन, वर्चुअल बैकग्राउंड, रिकॉर्डिंग, स्टैटिस्टिक, फीडबैक, उसके राइट साइड में है इंटर फुल स्क्रीन. उसके बाद स्केल टू फिट, साइड टू साइड मोड, साइलेंस सिस्टम, यही है, और तो कुछ नहीं है.
एक काम करिए, एक बार लॉग आउट होके एक बार लॉग इन वापस. You can start, sir.
Can start?
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm sorry to get you all at this time of the day when you should probably be sleeping, but this is probably the best time, I think, for me today. So I thought that I'll subject you also to this insult at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I hope you don't mind. The topic today that I've chosen is actually an unusual one. It's not something that is usually discussed at urology meetings, and it's on renovascular hypertension. And the reason why I've chosen this particular topic is manifold. Firstly, I think we are going to see many more of these issues in the years to come, simply because we have an aging population. We have an aging population with a lot of diabetes and vascular disease. And
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
हेलो। हाँ
Hello.
निर्मल। हाँ डॉक्टर ने इनको एचपी को बोल दिया है हमने। हाँ देखो ऐसा है ना, और देखा देखो मैंने उनको बोला है कि जो भी है वो
एक मिनट भैया, हाँ ना,
Hello.
Hello, yes, sir. We are listening, sir.
Okay. No, we had a problem with power, and I think this is a lesson that I've learned today that we should not do it in the afternoon, because I think sometimes the Tamil Nadu Electricity Board just cuts the power at this time. So I don't know. Can you hear me
Yes, sir.
now? Okay.
Sir, you are able to hear me, sir?
Yes, I can, Pratik.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
yeah.
yes, sir.
Your hairstyle is changed. Eh? Pratik,
sir.
your hairstyle has changed. Eh?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can you
Okay,
hear
sir.
me? Can you hear me? Can you see the slide?
Yes, sir. I can see.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. So the reason is that renovascular hypertension is an important topic for urologists. I know many people are not interested in vascular work, but those people who are interested in transplant work will probably find benefit in this talk. Uh, Also, I think we're going to see a lot more of patients with this problem, considering that we are having aging population as well as a vast number of them with uncontrolled hypertension and diabetes. So we need to be aware of the fact that the renal artery also gets involved. The third reason is that many people do coronary angiograms for various reasons today. It's very popular to have an angiogram done as a routine screening or when you have a problem. And what the cardiologist usually does is that they do a run of the aorta. When they finish the angiographic studies for the coronaries, they do an angiographic run, and many of them find that they've got renal artery stenosis. The patient didn't know about it, neither did the cardiologist know about it, or the interventional radiologist know about it. So it's important to know that imaging today can
Some problem with system, I think. Pratik, is it audible?
No, no, not audible.
Can you hear me now?
Audible, sir.
Yes, sir.
Audible. Okay, right. Thank you. I need to get some feedback because this power is. I think we'll come back on domains now. We were on generator. So quite a lot of this work that I'm going to show you today, a vast number of those cases and everything that I was involved in, and along with my colleagues when I was in Vellore. And we probably have the largest series of patients with renovascular disease which have been treated in urology. And some of the work is continuing actually when I moved to Coimbatore. So uh, just a minute, Nitish is on the line. Yeah, Nitish? Yeah. No. There was a power problem, so I'll come back online. I'm back on. Right. Yeah. I'm just going to move the first slide. Um, the slide is not moving. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
The slide is not moving. I don't know why. Right. Okay. I got it back. So quite a lot of this. Yeah, Nitesh, I think there was some problem. The slide did move actually. I got onto the second slide. Okay. So as I said, quite a lot of this work was done in Vellore, and we still continue to do some of it, although much less. The reason being that when you're in a multi-speciality hospital, a lot of these patients will come from various other departments. So that's why a fair bit of experience that I gained when I was working in Vellore. So the strategy today is to take you through a case first. I'm going to ask you some questions in between and maybe give you the answers too, because it's and then I want to take you through the entire gamut of renovascular hypertension. So it's going to be a little long, and I hope that you will bear with me as we go along. So this is a story of a 10-year-old female child who presented with headache for 7 months, with vomiting and convulsions about a week before she was hospitalized. She was diagnosed to have hypertension and is on antihypertensive medication. And you can see that she's on 1, 2, 3, 4 antihypertensive drugs. So the important thing is for us to understand that how many people actually take blood pressure of children. When a child comes to the clinic, I don't think people actually take the blood pressures unless there's an event that happens in the child's history or the life that blood pressure is taken. And even if you do take blood pressures, many people don't have the right cuffs to take the blood pressure. They put the adult cuff on to try to take the blood pressure of a child. So, we are not actually geared this way. And it is not standard. It's not, shall we say, standard routine to take blood pressure of children. We assume it. But we must know that hypertension does exist in children, and renovascular hypertension does occur in between 3 to 10% of children who present to pediatrics with problems. So we need to have this thing aware. We need to be aware of the fact that hypertension and renovascular disease can occur in children. This child was 25 kilograms, and as you can see that I have asterisked the pulse, good volume in the right upper limb, and the blood pressure was 150/90 in the right upper limb. Now, it's very important when you're looking at patients who have hypertension to actually feel all the pulses. We were taught in medicine, feel all the pulses, upper limb, lower limb, carotids, and see whether they are synchronous. Pulses should be synchronous and should be regular, good volume. And you can make this out just by simple palpation. Simply because one of the commonest conditions that we can identify by just measuring the pulse, by feeling the pulse, is coarctation of the aorta. It's one of the commonest causes for hypertension in children. So we must do this. So simple blood, measuring putting a hand on the pulse and making sure that you have all the pulses are equal is a good idea. Now we know that the blood pressure in this child has been recorded as 150/90. And I put it down as JNC 8. This is the Joint National Commission created by the American Cardiologists Heart Association, and they meet periodically and try to revise the criteria for hypertension. And JNC 8 is the latest and they've got certain criteria to list actually hypertension in people. And it's usually in adults that this thing happens, and therefore in children, this is not really looked at. So 150 or 90 for a child who's 10 years old is very high and should be considered as hypertensive unless otherwise proved. So this is important to know what the blood pressures are in children. If you go onto the net, you can actually download blood pressure readings in children as the age advances. And by the time the child is about 12 years old, they should have regions of blood pressure as the adult, 120, 80, etc., 110, 80, etc. So this is important to know as far as children are concerned. Now, if we are looking at renal artery stenosis, the positive finding that we are looking for is a renal artery bruit. Now, everybody won't have a renal artery bruit, but you must, once you begin to suspect renal artery stenosis, then it's a good idea to put a stethoscope, if you have one, in the loin area. You can actually do it by putting the stent on the abdomen, but not in the midline, but by the side of the midline in that situation. The reason is that if you press on the abdominal wall in children and even in some adults who are thin-built, you can actually press the aorta and you can get a bruit because the blood pressure is so high that you'll get the systolic bruit and you will confuse that for renal artery stenosis bruit. So that's why it is better to hear it in the back, in the loin area, in the so-called renal point. And the bruit is classically described as both systolic and diastolic. So it's a systolic plus a diastolic bruit, which is heard in the loin. And this is a very rare finding. I have heard it also in patients very rarely. And whenever we used to hear something, we call everybody and say, come and listen to a renal artery stenosis bruit. So it was very typical. Once you listen to it, you'll never forget it, like many other signs in clinical medicine, but it's a rare sign. Now, this child had a urine analysis done and the protein was 2+. And that's important to remember because one of the commonest causes of hypertension, this we are dealing is renovascular hypertension, we know, is a secondary hypertension, is called secondary hypertension, not primary or essential hypertension. It is called secondary hypertension. And the commonest cause of secondary hypertension globally is chronic kidney disease, chronic glomerulonephritis. Similarly, in children also, we have to consider renal parenchymal disease as an important cause for hypertension in children. And therefore, when you have 2+ excretion of protein, it does become important. But if you look at this slide, you will see that RBCs are 3 to 4, and there are no CAS. So if this child did have renal parenchymal disease, I would expect that there would be RBCs in the urine, and I would expect some CAS, RBC, CAS, etc. 2+ protein is allowed in patients who do have renovascular hypertension or renovascular disease. You won't get nephrotic range proteinuria. If you get nephrotic range proteinuria, then there is obviously serious glomerular damage, either independent of renal vascular disease, or that is the only problem. There is no renovascular disease, it's only all glomerular. So we need to remember this, that you can have mild proteinuria, and I've seen up to 600 milligrams of protein excretion in patients who do have renovascular disease. Now, the important thing to remember here on this particular slide in the hematological evaluation is the hemoglobin of these people. Quite a lot of these children and quite a lot of the patients who do have hypertension due to renovascular disease may have a low hemoglobin. The important thing here is the serum creatinine. The creatinine in this patient is high. For a 10-year-old child, this is a high creatinine. This is not a normal creatinine. I would expect the creatinine to be in the range of less than 0.8, 0.6 to 0.8. And the reason why electrolytes are also done is because if you're looking at secondary hypertension, you want to look at Conn syndrome, etc. So therefore, these electrolytes have been done. But generally speaking, today we're just going to discuss renovascular hypertension, and therefore I'm not going to talk about all the other conditions which can give rise to renal arteries, which can give rise to secondary hypertension. Now, as far as ultrasound is concerned, it is necessary when you have a patient who has got a renal problem or hypertension. It's common to do an ultrasound. But I'll tell you as to what is the role of ultrasonography later on. But at this point in time, the important thing to remember looking at this ultrasound slide is this disparity in the renal size. Now we know that the right kidney is a little smaller than the left. And therefore, when you have the left kidney equal to the size of the right kidney, that is a significant finding on ultrasound. And if the left kidney is smaller than the right kidney, then that itself is a very significant finding. But here we have the right kidney, which is significantly smaller by nearly about 2 centimeters, and that is something that we cannot ignore. Now, the corticomedullary differentiation is maintained on both sides, which would suggest that the renal parenchyma is not altered. There is no other PCS abnormality, there is no hydronephrosis, etc., which could actually, as a result of pressure atrophy, gives rise to hypertension. So the ultrasound does give us information mainly on kidney size and more importantly on the parenchyma. If you did have an alteration in the renal silhouette, that means the renal shadow is not seen clearly, or the outline, the border is not clear, or the border is irregular, then you would suspect chronic pyelonephritis, secondary to probably reflux in some of these children. So looking at the kidney size, looking at the border of the kidney, and looking at the corticomedullary differentiation is important to rule out other conditions and focus on the possibility of a vascular cause for hypertension. Now, all these will also, although this is a child, but even in the adults, these things matter. All these things are the same. Now, they've done a Doppler for this child, and they've found that the peak systolic velocity is 250, and that is significant. That is very significant on the right side. Anything less than 180 would be okay, but anything more than 300 is very significant of damage. Now, the importance of looking at the resistive index is that it will. Yes, Nitish? Hello? 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 Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. No, I don't know why Nitesh is calling me. I don't know. Hello? Hello, Nitesh?
Sir, that was by mistake, so you can carry on, sir.
Okay, right. Okay.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir.
Right. Okay, right. It was a slip of the finger. So if the PSV is less than 180, then that's acceptable. But anything more in the range of 180 to 200 or 180 to 250 is abnormal, and anything more than 300 will suggest a very high PSV, and therefore that is significant. It's important to also look at the resistive index of the kidney, because this will tell you as to what is happening to the parenchyma, and a low resistive index would indicate that there is a chance that reversal of the arterial lesion could actually result in improvement of renal function. If the very high resistive index will indicate that there is intrinsic renal damage within the substance of the kidney, and therefore this is going to have a poorer outcome measure when you revascularize or stent or whatever you want to do for this for a patient. So this is the role of a color Doppler. It will tell you what the wave pattern is, etc. Now, what about renin? In the old days, when we did not have renin tests, we would do selective ureteric catheterization to identify patients who have got renal artery stenosis. And from each kidney, we would measure the sodium excretion. And this would give us an idea as to lateralize which is the site that is involved. We didn't have ultrasound those days, and sometimes the kidney function would not be good, so we would have difficulty. And we used to do what's called pre-sacral air insufflation pneumogram. Air would be injected into the pre-sacral space to outline the kidney, and thereby you would be able to get an idea of what the kidney size is. Now, these are all old tests, but it's nice to know that how things have evolved over the years and how medicine has actually improved, and we've gone on. But the renin assay is a very fastidious test. It is written in the books. We are expected to know about it, but it's a very fastidious test, and it requires a lot of, there are a lot of do's and don'ts about this test. And so you just have to, you can take a renin assay, either a peripheral renin assay, as it's put PRA without sodium restriction. And in this particular child, it was 3.6, and they said that this is normal. Many labs don't do it. And when you send the blood, you have to send it in ice, and immediately they will take it to the lab. The way to actually do the renin assay is to actually selectively catheterize the renal vein and find out as to whether the renal vein to IVC ratio is more than 1.5:1. If it is 2:1, it's even better. So the current criteria state that if you have a renin ratio between the kidney, between the renal vein, index renal vein, and the IVC is 2:1, that significantly lateralizes that particular kidney to the site of the lesion. More importantly, it will also tell us that if you revascularize this kidney, that there is a very high chance of possible cure of hypertension in such an individual, because all the renin that is being produced is by this kidney. But having said that, when I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the pathology as we go along, you will realize that this particular philosophy of renin assay and renin excretion is not something that is taken as sanctum sanctorum. Now, this was the angiogram for this child, and you can see that there is no doubt that the ostium of both renal arteries is normal, but the proximal segment of the renal artery is narrowed, significantly narrowed on both sides. There is distal runoff. There is a bit of post-stenotic dilatation on both renal arteries. And the important thing is the aorta is looking quite good. The aorta is looking pristine in this child. And therefore, we have established the fact that there is significant renal artery stenosis. This child has got hypertension and many drugs with side effects, with actually the effects of hypertension not being controlled because she presented with vomiting, headache, and giddiness and fits, etc. So, this could be one of the earliest manifestations of actually renovascular disease, renovascular hypertension, that a patient actually gets encephalopathy. A young patient with hemiplegia or encephalopathy, we have to make sure that you're not missed out renovascular disease. So this is the story of this 10-year-old girl who presented to the clinic with hypertension. And we have gone through a certain battery of tests which have confirmed that this child has got actually renal artery stenosis on both sides. You know that from the ultrasound that the right kidney was more affected because the right kidney was smaller. The left kidney size was 8 centimeters, and it looks from this angiogram that the left kidney is not as bad. The stenosis is not as bad as the right kidney. So it's important to know what the gradient is, and I'll be talking to you about it at this in subsequent slides. So this is another image of the same thing, and you can see very clearly that the right side is significantly occluded, whereas the left is not so significantly occluded. There is a flow, there is mild degree of post-stenotic dilatation, but you can see that it's not as bad as the right side. And this is what the renal angiogram shows, that on the right side there was 90% stenosis, and on the left side they have said it is 70% stenosis with a post-stenotic dilatation. It is not sufficient for us to say that there is 90% or 30% or 70% stenosis. The proof of the pudding is to find out what is the gradient. What is the gradient? Because this is very important. Normally, there is no gradient between the aorta and the renal artery. Whatever pressure is there in the aorta is reflected in the renal artery. And if there is a gradient, anything which is more than between 10 to 20 millimeters gradient is significant. Anything more than 30 is very, very significant. And the reason where this figure of 70% stenosis comes into it is because they have measured gradients and correlated with the degree of stenosis. So between 10 to 20 millimeters of mercury would suggest that there is 70% stenosis in the renal artery, and this becomes significant. So there is a gradient, significant gradient. If there is no gradient at all, then many times on imaging, you will find that there is a narrowing, but there is no gradient, and that may not be significant hypertension. It is just a finding, which I told you sometimes we are seeing in patients who have routine angiography done for prior to coronary artery stenting, etc. Now, it's also useful for people to do a DTPA scan. They're doing it, and you can see that the GFR on the right kidney is very poor. But if you actually look at the kidney, you look at the intrarenal parenchymal, you look at the, intrarenal renal artery branching, etc., it doesn't give you what's called the withered tree appearance. Now, the withered tree appearance is a term that was used in the post-transplant situation, where in chronic rejection or in chronic transplant artery stenosis, you would get as though the entire architecture within the kidney, the arterial architecture has been withered, as though the tree has got no leaves. The branches are there, but there are no leaves. It's just absolutely dead. So this is called a withered tree appearance, and sometimes you can get that in patients who have a kidney. But if you looked at that right kidney, the angiogram, it wasn't looking like a withered tree. The parenchymal branching was good, and therefore this GFR is significant, not in terms of this could be fallaciously low. This doesn't mean that this kidney should be nephrectomized. That's the important thing to remember. Just a low GFR by itself doesn't necessarily mean that the kidney is useless. Some of these kidneys can actually recover if they are revascularized, and more so in children. So let's now come to looking at what is renovascular hypertension and this entire disease conglomerate. What's the definition? The definition is systemic hypertension secondary to renal artery compromise, and it is usually an occlusive lesion. So that's the definition of renovascular hypertension. It is secondary to renal artery compromise. The assumption is, when you have a definition like this, that if you remove the occlusive lesion, then the hypertension should be cured, because we have said that this is a curable cause of hypertension. In our early teachings, we said that one of the curable causes of hypertension is secondary hypertension due to, say, Conn syndrome, pheochromocytoma, etc. These actually cure the hypertension. Can we make that same assumption as far as renal artery stenosis is concerned? That will evolve as this lecture goes on. So correction, we assume that the correction of the renal artery lesion will cure the hypertension. It obviously stands to reason that if you read between the lines of what I'm saying, that some patients will be cured and some patients will not be cured. Now, what is the problem with renovascular disease? Many people do not know that they actually have hypertension. It's one of the commonest causes. And actually, many years ago, there was an article published in the NEJM listing as to what are the commonest causes of death among humans, many years ago. And I thought that, trauma and malignancy would be the commonest cause of death among humans in the world. But top of the list was cerebrovascular accident. Leading cause of death among humans is CVA due to obviously uncontrolled hypertension. And malignancy and trauma were way down on the list. Trauma was number 8 on that. I distinctly remember that article. So renovascular disease can actually accelerate existing hypertension. That means somebody is already hypertensive and suddenly gets worsening of hypertension. So that can happen as a result of renovascular disease. Renovascular disease can reduce renal function, and as a result of the vascular compromise, there is sodium retention. This is secondary to the activation of renal angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. We always must remember that is RAA, renal angiotensin aldosterone. We always think of it as renal angiotensin assay. No, it is RAA because aldosterone comes in and the secondary aldosteronism, and that is what is responsible for sodium retention. The sodium retention causes more cardiac compromise and we have problems. So this whole gamut of renovascular disease is syndromic. It is syndromic and not just one disease entity. It is one disease entity but produces a host of other issues. I just mentioned this, what is significant occlusion, and I said I want to reiterate again that classically there is no gradient, and if the gradient is between 10 to 20, it is 70% occlusion, and if it is more than 30 millimeters, it is significantly occluded. So, that particular girl on the right side, that gradient must have been very, very high for them to have said it's 90% occlusion, that you can eyeball itself and see that it was very bad. And I also mentioned here that all narrowing seen on routine imaging need not necessarily be dealt with. So just because the cardiologist calls you and says, hey, listen, I've got a patient who's got renal artery narrowing, please do something about it. Don't jump in and do something. It's not necessary. You got to assess the patient, you got to decide whether actually intervention is necessary. I distinctly remember a patient like this when I was in Vellore. It was a staff member's relative, and they didn't call us. They just went ahead and tried to balloon, did an angioplasty and stented it, tried to balloon it. The renal artery, they had a problem, it ruptured, and they controlled it, and sometime later this kidney actually just died because there was renal artery compromise and the kidney just went off. So, you don't jump in just to treat an X-ray finding, especially in urology. and more so when you have renal artery narrowing like this. So go back a little bit into the physiology of this. We know that the famous Goldblatt experiment. Goldblatt did experiments on dogs. He had 2 kidney model and he had a 1 kidney model. So the reason why this experiment is very important and still is very necessary for us to understand and keep it, that when we have 2 kidneys which are normal and you clip 1 renal artery, then that particular kidney will produce all the renin. The sodium angiotensin, the renal angiotensin aldosterone mechanism will kick into place. And because you have another normal kidney, the sodium retention effect doesn't come into place, and that opposite kidney, that is the contralateral kidney, which is normal, will excrete all the sodium, and therefore such a hypertension is not sodium and water dependent. Such a hypertension is purely renin angiotensin dependent, and therefore if you correct such a lesion, there is a very, very high chance of cure. And if you do all your renin assays, you will realize that all the renin is being produced by this. But the story is different if you have 1 kidney, 1 clip. That means you have a single kidney and that has been clipped, and then all the renin which was initially produced by this kidney, then as a result of the aldosterone coming in, sodium water retention, and then this becomes not a pure renin mediated hypertension, but it becomes a fluid mediated hypertension. So it's important to understand that when you have a single kidney, that is why when you have patients whose 1 kidney is gone, they don't know it is gone, the other kidney is has got vascular damage, suddenly they can go into fluid overload and present with pulmonary edema. So that is the genesis for this. And if you have both sides affected, then you'll have the same situation. They did some experiments on dogs and found that if you pre-treat them with ACE inhibitors, then actually hypertension is delayed in these patients, in these dogs. So there was that. And one thing to remember is, as I told you, the renin release is transient. Initially, the renin goes up, and then other systems kick into place. And that is what sustains the hypertension. So when you measure renin, it may not be high all the time. And this is one of the fallacies of the renin estimation. Because hypertension now becomes a systemic disease. As I told you, it is systemic hypertension. The definition, it is systemic hypertension, and the effects of target organ damage is much more in this situation. And therefore, you will realize that the hypertension which continues even after correction of the renal artery lesion is not cured simply because there are other factors which have come into play to sustain hypertension. It's important to remember as to what could be the result of renal revascularization. You need to discuss this with your patient, with the relatives, with yourself to decide as to whether you want to do something for such a patient or not. This slide very quickly shows you what we all know, the RAA system, renin produced by the index kidney, angiotensinogen in the lung, converts it to angiotensin 1, and then ACE angiotensin converting enzyme converts it to angiotensin 2, and then the entire cascade of events that take place to sustain hypertension. And actually, if you look at this, you look at angiotensin 2 and see what all it does. It's a very, very powerful vasoconstrictor, and it has so many effects. So just by stopping the process at this point, by correcting the renal artery stenosis may not actually help in many situations because all these other effects have come into play. So that's important to remember. What are the manifestations of renovascular disease? When you have renal artery stenosis, you can get asymptomatic or incidental, as I told you. You can get renovascular hypertension. As a result of the renal artery stenosis and reduced blood flow, you get ischemic nephropathy. Now, this is a dangerous situation. When you begin to get ischemic nephropathy, you begin to get glomerular damage. You begin to get glomerular sclerosis. And when this happens, recovery or curability of hypertension becomes very difficult. And such kidneys, when they have ischemic nephropathy, usually become atrophic, become small. And even sometimes when you nephrectomize them, the hypertension may not be cured. That is important to remember. Just by taking out a small kidney, it may not cure the hypertension. At best, it can reduce the number of tablets a patient is taking for the cure of hypertension. Because at this point in time, as I told you, the hypertension is becoming not renin mediated, but necessarily due to sodium retention and the cascade of events that I showed you in the previous slide. And as a result of renal artery stenosis, you can get accelerated cardiovascular disease, congestive heart failure, strokes, secondary aldosteronism. So this is an important slide, remember, as to what can happen as a result of renal artery stenosis. When you have a child or we have an adult with hypertension, this is a list of differential diagnoses you can get. You can get this hypertension can happen in acute kidney injury. You can get severe hypertension in chronic GN. Azotemia, chronic GN, hypersensitivity nephropathy is a list of differential diagnoses that you have when you're considering somebody who's got renovascular hypertension. If you think that that's a diagnosis, then you must be sure that you've ruled out these differentials. And we just showed you, I showed you some of the tests which could tell us whether the patient has got actually glomerular damage at all or not. Remembering at the same time that as a result of the ischemia, glomerular damage can occur due to secondary ischemic nephropathy changes. Now, when you look at the pathology of renovascular disease, there are basically three entities that we need to consider. Foremost on the list is atherosclerosis, which occurs in more than 80% of people, 80 to 85% of individuals. The next is fibromuscular dysplasia, which occurs in about 10 to 15, and then aortoarthritis, a very peculiar variety of arthritis, which seems to sort of be located or localized to the far eastern region, i.e. Takayasu's disease, first identified by this Japanese ophthalmologist, who was credited for having noticed this condition, and hence it's named after him. But many people have got different names for it. It's just called as an arthritis. Some people call it aortoarthritis. Some people call it the mid-aortic syndrome. So various terms are used for this. Why is it important to know what we're dealing with? Because the pathology is very different in each of them. And if you know the pathology, you will know what is the outcome of that pathology. Should you treat? Should you revascularize? Will hypertension be cured? These are important questions that will be answered once you know, identify the pathology. So it's important to know it. What about atherosclerosis? This is the usual story for patients with atherosclerosis. They're much older people. They have either diabetes, they have some form of dyslipidemia. The disease can be ostial or proximal. When you do an angiogram for them, you will find that the lesion is ostial or very proximal renal artery. It is invariably bilateral, and this condition is progressive. If you leave these lesions alone, the kidney will get damaged. When I say progressive, it doesn't mean that the atheroma could progress. It could fall off and block the artery and embolize the kidney, thrombose the kidney. But when I say progressive, the renal damage continues on. You can't leave atherosclerotic lesions unattended. Something must be done for this, either the hypertension or the atherosclerosis or both. And when you come to fibromuscular disease, it's easy to remember. These are usually younger people. They can be children. Usually they are women between the age of 5 and between the age of 15 and 50. Even young kids can get it. 5-year-old kids can get it. We know that the artery has got actually, any artery has got 3 layers, the intima, the media, and the perimedia, the subadventitia or the adventitia. And any area of the artery can be involved. And if you have a child, it is usually intimal, as we saw in the child, and it is progressive. If you leave this alone, this kidney will suffer. Medial, what happens is the medial gets weakened, and as a result of the pressure in the artery and the weakening, small little aneurysms bulge out in the main renal artery. And these aneurysms are larger than the diameter of the renal artery. Important to remember, because if you see it, sometimes in intimal as well as in subadventitial hyperplasia, you can get these aneurysms in the renal artery, and these aneurysms are smaller than the diameter of the renal artery. Whereas in medial hyperplasia, the classical string of beads appearance, and this usually is stable. So you don't have to run and jump and treat every patient who has the classical venous hyperplasia. But the other two varieties are very tight lesions, progressive, and destroy the kidney very rapidly. And the last variety actually can produce dissection of the renal artery and destroy the kidney function significantly. So it's important to know this. What about aortoarthritis? This is a condition, as I told you, was first described by a Japanese ophthalmologist, Mr. Takayasu. He observed it during fundal examinations, peculiar lesions in the eye, and we don't know what the etiology is. All sorts of things have been named. They say this is inflammation, they say immunological. Some people have said that this may be TB because in a recent, in some studies in South Africa, they found that the Mantoux test was positive, significantly positive in these patients, and they felt that this was evidence of tuberculosis. They're usually young adults and usually females, but I've seen both young men and women suffer from aortoarthritis. Now, there are two classifications for aortoarthritis. The important thing to remember, this is a more recent one, a little bit more complicated, because it's, as you can see, that this doesn't necessarily involve the aorta. It involves the entire major arterial tree, the aorta and its branches. But for some reason, it seems to have left out the mesenteric branches. And I'll show you X-rays of the mesenteric branches to show you that SMA can be involved in this lesion. And they seem to have left this out in their classification. So this is one classification. This is another one, which is an easier classification, remember. They just have 4 types. Supraaortic, aorta, aortic arch and its branches, type 2. Type 3 is abdominal aorta, including the renal arteries. Type 4 is a combination of 2 and 3. But right now, some people have said type 4 should, when you get all of them, plus the pulmonary artery. So this is the way that some people actually have looked at Takayasu's and tried to classify it. The vast majority of patients that we see are usually type 3, where it includes the abdominal aorta and the renal arteries, and that's what we are concerned with. Now, one of the classical features of Takayasu's arthritis is, for some reason, the left subclavian usually gets involved. And therefore, if you have a patient with Takayasu's disease, you will not be able to check blood pressure on the left hand. It's not that the limb is dead, the limb is warm, the limb has got blood supply from collateral circulation, but you can't feel the pulse simply because the left subclavian is blocked. And this is a very standard feature. So it's actually included as one of the criteria for diagnosis of Takayasu arthritis. The subclavian artery on the left side is involved. I'll just show you that. So this is very difficult disease to diagnose. It's very insidious, something like retroperitoneal fibrosis that we see. We don't know when it starts. It's a very insidious disease, and slowly it builds up. Some patients may have headache, malaise, polyarthralgia, all suggesting some immune problem in some of these patients. The lab tests are non-specific, just like what we see for RPF, and some of them can progress over an extended period of time to involve all these vessels. And here we have said, I've also put it as mesenteric arteries. In the chronic stage, you will have none of the early features of inflammation, and you have to actually look at differential diagnosis, which comes as aorta coarctation, Behçet's, radiation arthritis, etc. And these are all some of the later phases of the disease where differential diagnosis can become difficult. But generally speaking, once you see a patient, once you have these telltale features clinically, then you can safely make a diagnosis looking at the angiogram of so-called aortoarthritis. So because this is a complex condition, they have got some diagnostic criteria. There are obligatory criteria. There are obligatory criteria, and with these obligatory criteria, you have major criteria and minor. And you can see that the subclavian artery is mentioned in the major criteria. So if the subclavian artery is involved, you will have features. You could say that this patient, yes, probably has aortoarthritis. So if you have 2 major criteria, if you have 1 major and 2 minor criteria, if you have 4 or more minor criteria, then you could say that you have a diagnosis of Takayasu's depending on the feature. So this is an important slide to actually tell you what the diagnostic criteria are currently for making labeling a patient as having aortoarthritis. So how do you make a diagnosis of renovascular hypertension, renovascular disease? Just to go through again, clinical, laboratory, and imaging. The clinical presentation is very, very important. And in the exam, this seems to be a favorite question that is asked. As to how do you know that somebody with renovascular hypertension is suddenly with hypertension has got renal artery stenosis? These are all the criteria. If you actually look at all these criteria, I've just mentioned them in passing as we went along today's lecture. And this is just to actually dot the I's and cross the T's and make sure that you have got all these clinical features present in that patient. So accelerated hypertension. This is important because you have patient who's taking medication and he swears that he's taking his drugs, and suddenly you find that hypertension is out of control. That is worrying. Severe hypertension in the child, as we showed you. Edema, flash pulmonary edema. Suddenly the patient comes into casualty with breathlessness. You have to consider renovascular disease, and this is something that we must remember now, because we're seeing a lot more older people, we're seeing a lot more patients who do have atherosclerosis, and this is something that they can present with. So when you have some old man coming with this, don't just label him as having chronic kidney failure. He may have a reversible cause of his renal disease, and these are other features which are there on clinical presentation. Imaging. When we started trying to look for renal artery stenosis, we had the minute sequence pyelogram, and there were certain features which were very clearly described on minute sequence pyelogram. That is, you took three images after injection of contrast 1 minute apart. And then they said that sometimes, the calyceal appearance time is very subtle, and you may miss it between the 1 and the 2 minutes, and therefore they would do a 30-second sequence. So initially, they would start off with minute sequence, and then subsequently they went to 30-second sequence. And when they compared these, they found that, well, there was not much of a difference. So in the minute sequence pyelogram, to re-emphasize, what's the most important thing is the size of the kidney. The calyceal appearance time. Dense nephrogram, persistence dense nephrogram. Delayed nephrogram. And last but not least, ureteral notching, suggestive of the fact that there could be ureteral collaterals. Once there's an artery compromise, nature brings in collateral circulation. And classically, all these collaterals are around the ureter, and they actually on the IVU will produce notching. So ureteral notching was a classical sign seen in patients who had renal artery stenosis. Doppler, I showed you the Doppler findings in this child. Renal scintigraphy, well, captable renogram has been one of the gold standard ways to diagnose it. It has its own fallacies. It is based on the fact that when you give 25 milligrams of captopril and ACE inhibitor, you would reduce the GFR of that particular kidney. The problem is that when the kidney function is very poor, it becomes difficult because the isotope has to be taken up by the kidney. And secondly, if there is branch stenosis or bilateral disease, you're in trouble using the captopril study. So for some reason, the captopril renography study has sort of gone out simply because we have better imaging modalities. Digital subtraction angiography is a gold standard treatment, and one would do angiography or the standard angiography through the radial artery or through the femoral artery only if you're planning to do some intervention procedure, either a PTC, PRTCA, or you're doing some revascularization surgically. So CT angiogram and MR angiogram currently are gold standards for imaging a patient who's suspected to have renovascular disease, i.e. renal artery stenosis. So that's how it is. And the angiogram, the conventional angiogram is kept in place, kept at the time when you actually want to do some form of intervention. When you have imaging, these are the questions that you need to ask. Is the problem unilateral or bilateral? Is this the sole functioning kidney? What is the structure and function of the post-stenotic kidney? That means the SICV, where the artery is, what's the function of that? The important thing to ask is this stenosis responsible for the hypertension, chronic heart failure, renal dysfunction? This is very important to know, because you can't just be treating every stenosis and hope that you will cure the patient. And last but not least, when you revascularize this kidney, will this patient benefit? Now, this is a very difficult situation because right now the world is in an equipoise between whether we should treat these patients surgically or whether we should treat them with a combination of very good antihypertensive medication that is available. Simply because you can control the hypertension even by revascularization. You cannot guarantee a cure because the hypertension has become too far gone, and therefore there was a study done, and I'll allude to that study in a short while. So these are the typical X-rays of a patient who has got a digital subtraction angiography, and you can see in the top left the string of beads appearance, and you can see that the aneurysms are actually equal to the size of renal artery, or some of them are slightly bigger. You see the aortic arch here involved. The carotids are involved in this patient on the extreme right, and you can see the renal artery is involved, and the aorta itself is diseased in the bottom left. So these are just typical X-rays of patients who have renovascular disease, aorta arteritis, etc. Now this is a slide which showing you the extensive collateral circulation. Can you see my mouse? Can you see my mouse? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. You can see. Yes, sir. We can see.
Okay. You can see. Okay, right. So at any point, if you can't hear me or you can't see, just let me know, because I'm not sure whether I can. Whether I'm being heard. Okay.
Yes.
So these are all collateral circulation around the ureter, extensive. This is the angiogram of a child, of a young girl who had aorta arteritis, and there are two varieties of aorta arteritis on the angiogram that you can see. One is called the stenotic variety, and the other is the aneurysmal variety. They are two different things, and both of them can give rise to lesions of renal artery stenosis, and both of them can produce hypertension. So this is a girl who's got renal artery stenosis, you can see on the left side, whereas on the right side, you don't see any vessel at all. And now you can see later on, you can see as the angiogram evolves, you can see that there is on the left side a bigger kidney, where there is some renal artery on the right side. That is, you can see a silhouette. You can see a lot of collaterals. You can see these small little squiggy vessels around. This is all collateral circulation, all the way down, all these. So the kidney is being perfused by retrogradely through these collaterals, and whenever you have the kidney being perfused retrogradely or through collaterals, it is never a good blood supply. You must remember that the kidney requires high blood flow, 1500 ml of blood per minute, and small little vessels like this cannot. And therefore, when you revascularize, it's important to remember that your artery that you choose and the blood flow that you choose must be such that it can maintain and sustain GFR. It's very, very important to choose a vessel which is going to deliver that when you connect the kidney up. Here again, another picture of bilateral renal artery stenosis. On the left side, you can see that it's involving the mid segment, very, very tight. And on the right side, you can see there is involving the proximal segment and the post-stenotic dilatation, the bilateral RAS. Here's another patient who's got the stenotic variety. Both kidneys are involved. You can see that the aorta above the renal artery origins looks reasonably all right, but that mid segment, and that's why this is called the mid-aortic syndrome, because it was below the level of the aorta, below the level of the diaphragm, and just stopping at the level of the renal arteries. So both renal arteries involved here are narrowing, but the important thing to remember is that there is blood flow distally also in the limbs. And these patients, if you measure and if you actually look at the blood flow and you look at the blood flow in the limbs and actually measure it, there is not much of differential blood pressure change between the upper limb and the lower limb, indicating that although there is a radiological narrowing, it may not be necessary to actually improve this flow simply because this. And this was a girl on which I had actually done an auto transplant, and she did extremely well. You know, like you think that the flow in the iliacs is going to be poor, but it wasn't. You know, she actually had bilateral auto transplant, and she's done extremely well so far. Many, many years ago, this girl came when she was 12 years old to me in Vellore. Now, I'm showing this X-ray simply because, this angiogram, because I want you to observe a particular vessel. You can see my arrow, this artery. Okay? This is called the marginal artery of Drummond. Some people call it the artery of Raiola. And this, when it becomes prominent, would indicate to you that there is superior mesenteric artery involved. But the superior mesenteric artery is not seen, and you can see that this artery will go that way and retrogradely fill the small gut. Here again, you see this huge collaterals. It is very tempting to connect this collateral to the renal artery. Remember, it doesn't work. The blood flow in these collaterals is not enough to actually make that kidney work and produce a GFR which is sustainable. And here this is a case where there is actually renal artery, superior mesenteric artery involvement. This is the marginal artery of Drummond or the artery of Raiola, which goes along the left, along the descending colon and comes across on that side and supplies through the collateral circulation. And you can very faintly see here on the right side, very faintly see the renal artery and the arborization inside the kidney, very faint. Now here again, you can see the same patient I showed you the previous slides, the same girl, that kidney which you saw faintly, you can see that both the kidneys are excreted. So in spite of the fact that that kidney on the right side looks so bad, you can see the excretion is pretty good. And here again, to show you that there is SMA involvement, this catheter was not going beyond, and this is to show you how the SMA is blocked. And all the collateral circulation coming from the margin actually supplying the mid-colic and the right colic arteries. This is the Doppler, which classically shows the diastolic phase and usually both systolic and diastolic, what they classically call as the Barber-Stardust finding. And this is a very useful sign, especially in post-transplant renal artery stenosis to diagnose. And this is the gold standard test that is used in patients who have got transplant artery stenosis. And that is where the Doppler comes in. Doppler has more role today in transplant artery stenosis than it has in main renal artery stenosis. Main renal artery stenosis is a different volume. This is the CT angiogram, which is showing you the aneurysmal variety of aortoarteritis. It's very difficult to know whether this was actually atherosclerotic aneurysm or is it aortoarteritis. What causes it? Which came first, the chicken or the egg situation? And you can see that this is a large aneurysmal dilatation of the aorta, and you can see that there is some distal aorta here and the ALX. And you can see the superior mesenteric coming off here, and this is going off as a marginal artery of Drummond, marginal artery of Raiola. You can see that the renal arteries are not seen at this point, and they're probably involved in this aneurysmal dilatation of the aorta. This is what it looks like on a reconstructed image. You can see both the kidneys, but actually more importantly, you can see the aorta. This is the MR angiogram, and this is now actually a gold standard. You can see various pictures of fibromuscular disease in this MR angiogram, both the string of beads appearance and the smaller aneurysms which are seen on the bottom right. So, in a nutshell, what is the role of imaging? MR angiography is now the investigation of choice in most centers. CT angiography is a good alternative for patients who cannot have MRI, and it's also useful in the follow-up of patients who have renal artery stents because you can't put them into the MRI gantry. The main role of ultrasound is in the investigation of transplant renal artery stenosis, and contrast angiography is performed only as part of revascularization, standard angiography. Captable renography is used selectively, especially when you have good renal function and unilateral disease, it will help. So when it comes to management of renal artery rheumatoid hypertension, this slide tells you everything what it is. But the mainstay of treatment is actually antihypertensive medication. One thing we need to remember, that the quality of antihypertensive drugs that we have today are fantastic. In the early days, we had Rezapine, we had Ismaline, we had all these funny drugs which produced so much of side effects and could not actually take care of blood pressure control. When we were students, some of these drugs were, terrible. They would produce all sorts of side effects. But now we have specific drugs, excellent drugs, and therefore people are beginning to question what is the role of surgery when you have such good medication which can control the hypertension. Control the hypertension, reduce target organ damage, and you tell me that by surgery you cannot cure the hypertension. Why do you want to undertake such major surgery? Are you going to revive this kidney? Are you going to cure the hypertension? Are you just going to make it slightly better? So this is the dilemma that is facing all of us today when we deal with patients. So this is the list of the management, and you can see that at the end, I have got surgery, we've got renal artery bypass, nephrectomy, etc., as all these situations. So this is in a nutshell about the management. When it comes to medical management, the list of drugs that we have, most importantly, we also need to use some things to take care of dyslipidemia, because we say that we know that atherosclerosis is a major cause of renal artery disease today. So you have medical management using beta blockers, alpha blockers, diuretics, calcium channel blockers, ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, etc. So these are the mainstay drugs, and we have to choose among them as to which is the one that controls hypertension. Sometimes you may find that the patient will have to take 2 or 3 or 4. And even with that, the blood pressure is not controlled. That means things are not good. You can't persist with this sort of therapy. And I'll show you at the end a slide which will tell you as to when medical therapy should be disbanded and you should consider revascularization. Now, there was a very famous study done called the CORAL study, which tried to answer this question as to whether we need to actually do something surgically for these patients. Simply because when they looked at the data, both in children, there was a study done in the UK on 96 children, and in 96 children who had hypertension, only they were out of a total of 18 who had renovascular disease, only 2 could be cured of their hypertension by revascularization. So, it doesn't mean that just because you undertake major surgery that the hypertension will be cured. So they decided to do this study, a CORAL study, which was basically in adults, and it was a randomized study in atherosclerotic lesions, not in fibromuscular disease. So this was purely in atherosclerotic lesions, where they compared in one arm intensive medical treatment versus medical treatment and intervention in the form of either surgery or stenting, and they found that there was no difference. There was no difference in the outcome. So, you're left at the end as to whether you can just be going ahead and treating these patients with drugs and stepping in with surgery only at the appropriate moment when you think it's necessary, and not just rush into intervention in all these patients just because they've got a renal artery lesion. So what are the clinical factors which favor medical therapy with or without revascularization for renovascular disease? These are the factors which you need to take into account. The factors which favor medical disease with revascularization, these were all enunciated by the American Heart Association and the Cardiovascular Society of the world. So this is a very important slide because it tells you in a nutshell as to where you would continue with medical therapy and where you would do revascularization and medical therapy. So five criteria on favoring medical therapy with revascularization, and it's very clearly easy to understand as to what these indications are. And I've just gone through them as I went along in this lecture. Favoring medical therapy and surveillance without revascularization is when you have either extensive comorbidities, the patient is very old, or the blood pressure is controlled with drugs, stable renal function, no progression. It's easy to understand that these are the reasons, these are the situations where medical therapy will continue, and you just have to keep the patient on surveillance without actually jumping to any form of intervention. When I say intervention, I mean both stenting as well as surgery. So what about the endovascular procedures? Today, endovascular intervention has become a major thing, and the amount of surgery that is done on the aorta is again very little. In fact, even for leaking aortic aneurysms, endovascular stenting is done. I've seen it done in Mayo Clinic. They would wheel the patient in and put an endovascular stent, a covered stent, and that's it. These older guys would be saved of a major abdominal operation with all the morbidity. So you can do a percutaneous transluminal renal artery angioplasty, or you can do angioplasty with stenting. And you can use a drug-eluting stent if you want to in these patients. Now, what about when would you choose just angioplasty and when would you choose angioplasty with stenting? In children, they have shown that stenting is not a good idea. In children, simple angioplasty is good enough. In fact, when they did angioplasty with stenting in children, they found that the incidence of stent blockage was much higher. So children, angioplasty is sufficient, but for adults, it is not good. Plain angioplasty in adults results in a higher rate of restenosis, just the opposite, higher rate of restenosis, and therefore, just like in the coronaries, you have to put in a stent. And this is all basically because the vast majority of these patients have got atherosclerotic lesions and they are progressive, and therefore you need angioplasty with stenting. These are all the surgical treatments that are available on the aorta, aortic bypass, etc. You can pick this up when you go. These are all standard surgical treatments or revascularization procedures for the renal artery. We have also what is called extra anatomic procedures, where you don't connect in the previous slide I showed you where you can connect it to the main aorta. But as I told you, you do have certain other vessels which can actually supply enough blood flow to the kidney to maintain GFR. Remembering again that collateral circulation is not sufficient. So you need splenorenal, hepatorenal, gastroduodenal, etc. as bypass for this, for extra anatomic procedures. And commonly, most commonly, we would use the splenorenal on the left side and hepatorenal on the right side. If you have a very good gastroduodenal, then that can be used in some situations. I've never used a superior mesenteric simply because I would think that in the vast majority of patients that I've seen, the superior mesenteric itself is narrow. The important thing to remember is that when you have a superior mesenteric artery narrowing, the patient's gut is being supplied through collaterals by nature. Don't go and mess about with it. And do not connect the inferior mesenteric artery to the kidney because you will destroy that artery of Rayola and you will infarct the gut completely. I had to prove it to somebody, one of the cardiovascular surgeons, who felt that they should revascularize the superior mesenteric, and I told them what would happen. So I just put a bulldog clamp on the, temporarily put a bulldog clamp on the inferior mesenteric artery, and I showed him that slowly the entire small gut started to become pale, because that is the main circulation. Through this circulation is getting to the SMA, and that's being higher. So don't try to mess about with nature in many of these situations. What about other surgical procedures that you can do, extra anatomy? The commonest that we have done is renal autotransplant with or without aortic repair, endovascular aortic procedure with the renal autotransplant. So you can do the aortic procedure endovascularly and take out the kidney and put it in the right space in the iliac fossa. Or you can, what we have done is also bilateral simultaneous renal revascularization with aortic repair. Now this has been done, we did this in Vellore in some patients with the help of late Professor Sunil Agarwal, a very, very dear friend of mine who lost his life recently. And we had a good team there, and we used to do a lot of this work combined, aortic plus renal artery. So these are all the procedures that can be done in some of these patients. Just a slide to show you how the aortic graft can be placed, and you can see another graph which shows you the graft to the renal artery. So this is a very morbid operation. You know, you got to take the whole mesentery down, get it out, and then get to the aorta. So it's a morbid operation. The complications, etc., the post-op recovery is all very, very difficult. So you have to have a good ICU and a good facilities for doing this sort of surgery. This is a close-up of that, and you can see on the left here, this is another page. You can see the close-up here. This is all the aneurysm which was open. You know, this aneurysm had bled, and this is all the blood clotted inside the aneurysm. So the wall of the aneurysm is open, the graft is being put inside, and this aneurysm will cover this graft as a shield to sort of buttress it. You don't excise the aneurysm at all. So I've now come to the end of this presentation, and I just want to ask my colleague, Dr. Suresh Bhagat, who's sitting somewhere in Mumbai, to run a video of a young girl who presented with severe hypertension. She had stenting done, and both stents were occluded in the renal artery. She had surprisingly normal renal function, and she had classical Takayasu because she had left subclavian stenosis and left common carotid stenosis. So she had major criteria for us to diagnose this, but sadly, they put in stents and the stents are occluded on both sides. So I think this is the angiogram of this girl. You can see the stents on both sides, and you can see that there's no flow into that stent. And you can see that they managed to put a catheter through the stent and tell us that the intrarenal branching is good, but remembering that we are sitting right at the hilum, and you can see that if at all revascularization has to be done, it has to be an ex vivo repair, and you've got many branches there into that kidney. So we don't really have a stump of renal artery. We've got to do with sitting flush and maybe dissect out these arteries. Bhagat, are you there? I can ask now Bhagat to show you the video. Can you run the video? Hello? 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 Are you there?
Hello.
Yeah, Suresh?
Can you see my
Okay.
screen, sir?
Okay. I cannot see your screen, but you can run the video. I've still got my screen.
Okay.
Can you run the?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, run the video. This video was actually presented by Dr. Bhagat at UCCon in Chennai, and he got the first prize for this video. So hats off to him for that.
Can you see my screen, sir?
I cannot see, but can the others see?
No, sir. No, sir.
I have to stop sharing now, I think. Is that correct? Do I have to stop sharing?
Yes, sir. You should stop sharing then.
Okay, I've stopped sharing. Okay, now, right.
Can you
Now you can go on.
can you see
Okay,
now?
I can see you, but I can't see your. You have to share. I can see you, but I cannot see the video.
Okay.
Sir, you
Do you want
need
me?
to share
Do
your
you, do you want me to? Do you want me to show it from here?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go to share screen and show this. Let me see. Can you see this now?
No, we cannot see, sir.
How do I do that?
Sir, you have to switch on, sir.
Yeah.
You have,
I have
to
to switch
switch
off?
on the
Yeah.
video and then share the screen, sir.
I have to switch it on, is it?
Yeah.
Or does Bhagat?
Just
Can you
minimize
switch it on?
this Zoom screen, then switch on the video, and then you share the screen.
Shall I exit mine?
No, don't exit, sir. Just minimize it, sir. If you exit, then you will leave the meeting, sir.
Oh, I see. Okay. No, if I just exit the PowerPoint.
Yeah, PowerPoint, if it is
I
done,
can.
sir, you can exit it, sir.
Yeah, I'll exit the PowerPoint for the time being. Now I can. Can you show that?
Sir, are you able to see the screen on your this thing? Are you able to see the video when you press?
No,
share screen?
I'm not able to see.
You have to switch off the video in the background, sir. You click the videos, keep it on only, on the background.
Is that? Are you telling Bhagat or are you telling me?
So you are sharing the video, no, sir?
No, Dr. Bhagat is supposed to show the video from there.
And then Bhagat sir, can you switch on the video in background and then share your screen?
Okay. Yeah.
Just go to share screen and press the video.
Can you see now?
No, sir.
Are you running it, Bhagat?
Yeah. Can you see now?
No, sir. Share screen and click the video, sir. Once you click share screen, you will see the video there, and then you can do, sir.
If you share screen, that video will come
Yes,
up.
sir. Now you are sharing, sir. Now
Okay.
you are sharing.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Can you see now?
We can just see something, but not the video.
Okay, now? Can you see now?
Hello.
Hello?
Yes, sir. No, it's not. So I think
The
in your
video is not coming.
say in
No,
your so in your system preference, you have to give access to the Zoom for that. I think it will be may not be possible now. I think it's Mac, no sir.
yes, Mac.
So we have to give access to Zoom to access your screen setting, screen sharing. Then only we can do. So you have to go to system preference and then do, sir. It will take some time. I think we can share.
Okay. Okay.
Let.
Then leave it. Let me see whether I can do it through me.
If you have video, sir, you can share easily. So if you are not having.
Yeah,
Mac.
but I'm not able to get back into Zoom. I'm still
Sorry,
on
sir?
Zoom, but I'm still with you, but I'm not able to. Get
Sir,
back
you have
into
to
that
stop
original.
sharing. Suresh, sir, you have to
Yeah.
stop sharing your
Okay.
video.
Bhagaji, you stop sharing?
Yeah, stop.
Sharing? Yeah. Now you try, sir. You should be able to, sir. Just like how you do PPT.
Okay, now I'm back the PPT. Now,
Switch on the video, then go to screen share, and then you share the screen.
no, but I don't have the Zoom.
Zoom will be somewhere below in the bar, sir.
That's what I'm looking at. Somewhere it is gone.
Sir, have you downloaded the video, sir? What I've sent through email?
Yeah, I downloaded it.
Okay, so just open that only.
Yeah, but then I don't know where my Zoom is.
No,
The Zoom
just share the screen.
I'm not able to get the share screen business.
So Zoom will be in lower bars or somewhere.
I am looking for it.
Or press escape, sir. Press escape. Now you will be able to see. Or control tab you press. Control and tab you simultaneously press. Sir.
Yeah, I got the control and tab, but I don't. I need.
Suresh, sir,
Yeah.
can you send me the link?
Okay. Yeah.
We just run it and see. Are you guys still there, or we?
Yeah, I can.
On WhatsApp also, if you is
No,
it cloud or
it is on my desktop, so I can just send you the through email.
but desktop link how I can open?
You tell me your email ID.
drniteshjain@yahoo.com.
Okay.
I'm just sending on your chat box, sir.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Nitesh?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Nitesh Jain, na?
Yes, sir.
At yahoo.com.
Yes, sir.
Just check. I'm sending you.
Yes, sir.
I think your DRNITESHJAIN
Yes, sir.
dot, yeah, at, okay. Have you received?
Yes, sir.
You can don't. It's not. It's only 355 MB.
Take a while actually.
Hello.
Yeah, it will take 5 6 because I'm also streaming through the same hotspot there. Na? This thing, no? Take 5 6 minutes.
Hello? Hello? Yes? Right? Pratik?
Able to hear you, sir. Able to hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, right. So basically, we've come to the end of the presentation. Just if there are any queries that need to be asked, you can do so. I think just to summarize, the important thing is recognition of renovascular disease. Every patient with renovascular disease need not have renovascular hypertension, but those who do have renovascular hypertension as a result of renal artery disease, you need to identify the pathology which is causing that renovascular disease. And then subsequently, depending on the pathology, you treat. You've got very good antihypertensive medications. It doesn't mean that everybody whom you revascularize or stent will have cure of hypertension, but we will have at least improvement in hypertension. You might have improvement in GFR, or you may find that existing GFR may be maintained. So for some time, you can actually keep the patient away from end-stage renal failure. But if the things have gone too far beyond, then slowly over time, these kidneys will suffer, and you may have to have a situation where you do have uh, renal failure. So basically, you have wherever you need to go ahead and is Dr. Suresh online?
No, sir. Sir is not there.
Because it's put here Suresh Bhagat to all panelists. So basically, we are looking at how, and I think you need to go back to Andrew Novick's articles where he's done a lot of work as to how you can actually predict whether some of the patients will improve, not improve, kidney size. Sometimes you may have to do kidney biopsies. I've not told you that, but you may have to do kidney biopsy beforehand or intraoperative biopsies to make sure about glomerular preservation, etc. And one of the other features that he talked about in atherosclerosis, Andrew Novick, was the fact that if you have atherosclerotic ischemic nephropathy, but in the kidney itself, if you have atherosclerotic embolization, which has taken place as a result of the renovascular disease, and such patients usually have a poorer outcome to revascularization. So kidney size, presence or absence of atherosclerotic emboli, glomerular sclerosis, the nature of the pathology, the age of the individual, comorbidities, all these will play a role in deciding whether you keep these patients on medication or whether you go for medication and stenting or medication and surgery, depending on what your preferences are. But remember that everybody who's got renovascular disease doesn't necessarily need surgery, and everybody who's got renal artery stenosis, even with surgical correction, need not have their hypertension cured, although renal artery stenosis is still classified as a curable hypertension. So thank you very much. I've taken a lot of your time. I think there has been a lot of issue related to the video, but teething trouble. I've never.
Sir, I have two doubts in this. Sir.
Ask queries there. Yes.
Sir, one thing, what is the role of doing a functional study before if planning for any intervention, or if, because anyway when you are planning for, when you start him on antihypertensive, the compromised renal function is going to improve. So before starting on him, what is the role of doing a functional study prior?
Very important, no? Whether this kidney is functioning or not functioning. You want to know, no? If the kidney is totally non-functioning, supposing the kidney's GFR is very poor, kidney size is small, all the features which are taken into account will decide as to whether you want to do anything from the point of view of intervention. Otherwise, if the kidney function is so bad, you control the patient with drugs. If revascularization and stenting is not going to help you cure the hypertension, then you continue this patient on drugs. And if with drug therapy, the kidney hypertension is continuing to be bad, then two things you have to look for. You have to look for the kidney which is affected and the opposite kidney also, because hypertension is a global phenomenon and the other kidney may have been compromised as a result of sustained hypertension. So those are things that you may have to look at. Just by doing nephrectomy for a polyfunctioning kidney may not solve the problem. So functional assessment is very, very important. Any patient.
Most of the cases, we need to get a functional assessment prior to starting on antihypertensive also.
Yes. The reason is that if you don't have, suppose you start the patient on ACE inhibitors, angiotensin to receptor blockers, then this will affect the GFR. And if a patient has got a higher creatinine, that kidney function will deteriorate. So it's very important to know what the state of function is of each individual kidney. And if the creatinine globally is more than 2, if the creatinine is more than 2, some people say 2.5, then even giving angiotensin receptor blockers could be dangerous because the creatinine can shoot up, because it will drop the GFR on the side or beyond the lesion, and the kidney will suffer. As it is, the kidney is suffering with ischemia, and then you drop the pressure by more, it will suffer more. So this is like a double whammy situation for you. So you got to be very careful when you have renal failure. And Andrew Novick's article, where he looked at the kidney function, which is likely to improve, any serum creatinine more than 4, is unlikely for any revascularization procedure to improve renal function. That kidney is gone beyond it. So this patient is better off on, when he comes to a point, put him on dialysis and then do a new transplant and then evaluate at that point. So revascularization beyond that is.
But in these patients, when bilateral renal artery stenosis is present and creatinine is normal, but whenever the creatinine is in the higher side, as you said, if it is more than 2, does it hold any role again for the scintigraphy study, sir, in that scenario?
No. If you have established bilateral renal artery stenosis, okay, you have done an angiogram?
No, sir. Just in screening ultrasound we did, and we got those parameters suggesting it is having bilateral renal artery stenosis, sir.
Okay.
Followed by which we can directly go for
angiography. And the creatinine is too. You can directly go for angiography and you can go for stenting. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You have established that there is bilateral disease and you've got significant stenosis. That means you know that there is a pressure gradient across the renal artery and aorta.
Yeah.
And then therefore you will have to do some form, because if you leave these kidneys behind, they are likely to compromise further, simply because the gradient is high.
Sir, and in workup, sir, is there any role for in children, sir? In this case, is there any role for doing echo or fundoscopy and all those things?
It's very necessary. It's very necessary to look at all the other things, because some of these children may have problems. You can have papilledema. You can have papilledema. In fact, malignant hypertension in those days was defined as, with the presence in hypertensive or papilledema, it was called malignant hypertension. Now the definitions have changed a bit, but papilledema is a very important. So you must know what is the coronary status. In fact, it is recommended that in patients who have atherosclerosis in particular, remembering that atherosclerosis is 80% of the population. And therefore, maximum amount of work has been done on atherosclerosis. Little amount of work has been done on FMDs. Okay?
Yes,
and FMD revascularization, probably we have the largest experience on revascularization procedures for FMD. But for atherosclerosis, we need to remember that you have a situation where there is likely to progress. So therefore, you will have to look at the coronaries. And it is recommended that the coronary revascularization is done first, then the renal revascularization. Because you need a good pressure head, from the heart to drive GFR. If you have a weak heart, it's not going to work. That is why in the days when transplant started, we had poorer patients because of uremia. They used to get uremic cardiomyopathy, etc. The coronaries were poor. The ejection fraction was poor. We didn't have ways to assess this. There was no place for doing stenting in those days. So you would put a new kidney inside and there will be no pressure head to drive the GFR. You see, you need 1,500 ml of blood and it has to be pumped from the heart. So if the center is at fault, there's no point in having a normal artery tree. There's no pressure pump. So you got to improve cardiac function. And therefore, cardiac function becomes an important criteria in assessment of patients before revascularization. That's why in that one slide I showed you about coronary congestive heart failure and coronary cardiac function. Very important.
And sir, you listed a lot of reasons, etiologies for renal artery stenosis. So in children, fibromuscular hyperplasia is a cause in which all arthritis and vasculitis also comes. So do we need to investigate in the workup of vasculitic serological investigations as such?
You need to know whether the arthritis is active at all or not. Just like in RPF, I told you, just like RPF, you want to know whether the RPF is active. What are the criteria to know whether disease is active? You do CRP, LDH, ESR.
Yes, sir.
And it is recommended that when the disease activity is high, that means the immunological profile is still not settled in. You are advised to start these patients on steroids.
Yes, sir.
In arthritis. And if you believe that there's TB is a cause, then some people I know give them anti-tuberculosis treatment. But I don't believe that this is tuberculosis. I have done biopsies of the retroperitoneal, biopsies of the aorta, everything. I have not found anything that suggests TB in them. So this is to me like an immunological phenomenon, and it produces this reaction. And ongoing process by ESR, etc. You wait till the ESR comes down. And some people have given a figure of 20 millimeters of mercury for ESR to come down, and then it's okay. You can go ahead and revascularize, but that's a different. That's for aorta arthritis.
And sir, there are some criteria for salvageability, sir. In that, the size of kidney comes like more than 9 centimeters.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in that scenario, in child's size of kidney already will be 8 or 9 centimeter in these 10 to 12 years. So is that criteria hold good for that? Or and the second thing is like
no.
No, sir.
It doesn't. The criteria holds true only for adults.
Adults. Okay.
No, because Andrew Novick did all his work on adult kidneys, and it was 9 centimeters. And between 7 and 9 is a gray zone.
Okay. Sir.
There are kidneys which are 7 centimeters which have recovered, and there are some which have not. Okay. So I think it's important to know that that's what it is, and decide as to what it is. In the child, the kidney size is smaller, and we have shown.
Yes, sir.
So that 8 centimeter, 6 centimeter size, those kidneys need to be revascularized either by stenting or whatever you want to do.
Thank you.
Sir, there is any role for medical treatment if
yeah.
In fibromuscular dysplasia, sir? In fibromuscular dysplasia.
No. There is no role for treating the. You treat the hypertension.
Okay.
You are not treating the disease. In atherosclerosis, you are treating the disease also by controlling smoking, diet, statins, lowering the lipids and all that. But in FMD, there's nothing like that.
Yes.
You can't give a drug which will control because you don't know the cause of fibromuscular dysplasia. So you control hypertension. You give antihypertensive drugs.
In those cases, we can go directly for percutaneous transfemoral angioplasty, sir?
Because FMD, as I told you, except the medial variety, the other two are progressive lesions. The intimal fibroplasia and the periadventitial fibroplasia are progressive lesions, and therefore they need to be dealt with. And these are younger people, and therefore you can try angioplasty, stenting, etc., whatever, or revascularization. The studies which have been done are all on atherosclerotic. That's a major thing, and we have limited data on arthritis. Of course, now more and more is being done. Chitra Tirunal have also done a lot of work on aortoarthritis. A book has been produced by a person called Sen Gupta from Calcutta. So there's a lot of work on arthritis here, mostly done by cardiovascular people and cardiologists. So that's the thing. Is there any other question? Anybody else? I don't know about, I'm not on Facebook, but I don't know if anybody else. Okay. Do you know of anybody else who wants to ask a question? Okay. Right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bhagatji. That was there in the slide. Yes. One minute. Just hold. One minute. I'm just trying to see if we can leave the meeting. How can you see me? I'm still on. Yeah, okay, right, okay. No, the criteria basically you have one list I showed you is major criteria and minor criteria. That is for making diagnosis. Now you want to know salvageability of the kidney. You look at kidney size, mainly kidney size, and you look at up to 7. Between 7 and 9 is gray zone. Over 9 is good. Less than 7 is not good. then you look at renal biopsy and see whether there's presence or absence of glomerulosclerosis at all or not. And if you have proteinuria, nephrotic range proteinuria is not a good idea. So if you have minimal proteinuria, preserved glomeruli, tubular atrophy is accepted. Tubular atrophy is accepted, but glomerulosclerosis is not accepted. If there is glomerulosclerosis and the presence or absence of atherosclerotic emboli. Atherosclerotic emboli is atherosclerotic emboli in the kidney on biopsy is an indication of ischemic nephropathy. And if there is ischemic nephropathy, then salvageability of such a kidney becomes GFR, I showed you that GFR is a very poor indicator by itself. Yes. And then 2 ml GFR, those kidneys are all good, children, so it's become very difficult. Yes. So that's the problem with GFR. Individual GFR. Okay. Thanks, Bhagat, for showing the video. Thank you for Bhagat ji. I suggest one thing. Can you put that video on YouTube? Here? Put it on YouTube. Put it up. Okay. Right. Thanks. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can we exit?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Hello.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. It was nice, very nice class, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.